defaced, eroded, buried, decomposed, uncovered, weathered, vandalized, stolen, and recovered. It is a miracle that any of the low-relief carvings on this volcanic stone, known as Izapa Stela 5, are still visible at all. In addition to the physical deterioration, the healthy academic debate about its meaning has been largely silenced. Over 2,000 years since its creation, Izapa Stela 5 now stands again in its original location, along with over 100 other stone monuments at Izapa, Mexico. They stand as a reminder of a once flourishing Mayan civilization and should be a central topic for connecting Mesoamerican cultural identity to its origins.
Izapa is unique because it's never been built over. And so there's 140 plus monuments that are all in their original locations. And so we get to go all the way back to the origins of why are these stones laid out the way they are? What does the carving on those stones mean and how do they interact?
The varied interpretations of what is carved stems from the difficulty of discerning what was originally there. In 1938, educator Carlos Calabro found Stela 5 on its back in the jungle and did the first drawing. He interpreted what was on the stone as a market scene. In 1941, on a National Geographic and Smithsonian Institution expedition, archaeologist Matthew Sterling said of Stela 5, "This curious stela is the largest and most ambitious in composition of any at Izapa." In 1958, Brigham Young University Archaeology Department Chair Dr. M. Wells Jakeman published a paper on similarities of the carving to ancient Near Eastern representations of the Tree of Life. Jakeman's work included a detailed drawing and interpretations of many of the hieroglyphs on Stela 5. From 1963 to 1973, archaeologist V. Garth Norman, under the auspices of the New World Archaeological Foundation, photographed the major Izapa sculptures, created line drawings, and published peer-reviewed albums of the reproductions and extensive analysis of what they depict. His discoveries include key astronomical alignments with the Izapa mounds and stela, the discovery of the Babylonian and Egyptian cubits as a standard of measure at Izapa, and the Maya world calendar system on Stela 5. But in 1999, in an effort to redirect discussions on Izapa interpretation, anthropologist John E. Clark of Brigham Young University and artist Ix Marino redrew Norman's NWAF sculpture drawings. In a non-peer-reviewed publication of the new drawings, Dr. Clark boldly proclaimed, "We firmly believe that further examination of the Izapa sculptures will likely reveal no significant data beyond what our drawings now show." Does this new rendering of Stela 5 truthfully take us back in time, where we can discover for ourselves what the creators of Izapa wanted to teach us? Or are we being misdirected? Let's investigate. Dr. Jason Jones, with a grant from England's prestigious University of Warwick, used emerging technology to examine the faces of the Izapa stelae.
This surface texture mapping technique, specifically reflectance transformation imaging, which is a technique that was pioneered out of HP Labs and has been promoted heavily by cultural heritage imaging. It's now a widely accepted method for documenting very shallow relief and shallow textures. I've done it on multiple continents. We do it on paintings. We do it on archaeological carvings and other things. This is a very robust technique. This is able to go down and look at details that are on the scale of the thickness of a human hair. And so it gives us a far less subjective method of analyzing what the texture of that rock really is.
This technique uses light to map the surface of an object. It can be understood by looking at how sunlight moves across the Earth. As the sun moves through the sky, moving light and changing shadows help reveal the actual shape and texture of the surface of the Earth. Notice how the detail and patterns of the drifting sand becomes well illustrated as the sun moves in time. Fortunately for us, the modern RTI technique can help reveal the texture of these worn stones by tracking the movement of light and shadows in a similar way. This technique combines many photos taken from a fixed camera position with different lighting angles. The result is a map of the stella's texture and the ability to see it lit from virtually any angle. It also can display the stela as if the carved surfaces were shiny. Over the last decade, archaeologists V. Garth Norman and Dr. Jason B. Jones used this technique in cooperation with the Mexican archaeology authorities, INA, to preserve a record of the most detailed and important stele at Izapa.
We absolutely are using the world-leading technique to capture this data. It's the same that's used at the Smithsonian, at Harvard, at Cultural Heritage Imaging. All of these institutions are gathering around this technique because it's so powerful.
This data preserves a record of how much detail remains on each stela against additional weathering or damage.
3D scanning is ideal for capturing an overall form of something. It can also capture color. What is more difficult is that often you're not measuring the surface normals with the same degree of fidelity. And so where you actually want the surface texture, that's where this technique shines.
Comparison is revealing remarkable agreement between the RTI imaging and the photographs taken during the excavations of Izapa in the 1960s and 1970s by the New World Archaeological Foundation. This helps clarify many of the details carved into the stele at Izapa.
So Clark and Moreno did work in 1999 in which they used a video camera and side lighting to zoom in and out of these stelae and claimed that they had documented at a revolutionary level the detail that no one would ever be able to replicate again. My personal response to that is they were able to identify some details that were not, up to that point, identified at Izapa. They also then illustrated many things that were subjective and are not substantiated by surface texture mapping now. So I don't believe that what they did, that they ever made their primary documentation available for interrogation. And the methodology that we have used does not sustain about 95% of the changes they have made to the original NWAF drawings and surveys. Their technique was analog. Part of my concern and my hypothesis is that their explanation of using the zoom feature let them zoom so far in, they actually lost context for everything around it. And if you get too deep in without context, it's very easy to confuse the random surface texture that's the result of weathering with carved detail. And we have documented in numerous places details that they assert are on that stone with neighboring marks of the same depth and same surface normal that they disregarded, that they cannot ignore if they're going to maintain the features that they've asserted.
The 1941 Matthew Sterling Smithsonian Institution photo, when compared with the texture map, supports the accuracy of both the 2017 texture map and the Norman drawing.
Looking at the texture mapping, we can see some additional detail on the faces and in the god masks compared to what was documented in the 60s and 70s. What I will emphasize is the 60s and 70s drawings were conservative in claiming what was actually there. So there's no contradiction with what was originally documented. There's just additional detail to add. As with other motifs on Stela 5 specifically, the Clark and Moreno drawings have gone to a detail maximizing level that is not sustained by texture mapping. It's very difficult to identify the body of a crocodile on Stela 5 at Izapa. However, there is another stela at Izapa that has a tree that does merge into a crocodile. Stela 25 does do exactly what Clark and Moreno identified, but that's not actually what's on Stela 5. In their methodology, they said that they intentionally mixed motifs from different stelae together. I'm perfectly happy to accept what they've drawn as an artistic rendering. That is a correct statement. But to simultaneously claim it as the most detailed and accurate representation of Stela 5 at the same time is absolutely false. And both cannot exist at the same time, and surface texture mapping gives us the clear evidence, the primary evidence, that anybody can look at and compare and know. Next to the tree, just to the left, there is a figure that was interpreted early as appearing to have a hood over their face. The presence of that hood is very clear looking at the texture mapping. The details that have been interpreted as his face by Clark and Moreno, it's not clear from texture mapping how much of that really is face and deserves further investigation. One of the most difficult things on Stela 5, as portrayed by Clark and Moreno, originally had been described as an incense burner on the left and a small person, possibly a child, on the right. Clark and Moreno changed the figure on the right into an incense burner and embellished both with details inspired from other stelae. They've taken what would normally be considered rain glyphs, them into fire on the incense burner on the left. This is simply not correct. So the fact that they claim this about that incense burner gives me great concern about the wider claims that they've made. Because detail after detail after detail, they have been too artistic in what they have claimed is correct and accurate. The surface texture map on the right-hand side shows someone that appears to be in a seated position with what could be a stylus. Others have claimed it could be other things, but the surface texture map doesn't give us additional detail to claim anything other than what has already been stated. The texture mapping has a lot to elucidate and clarify about the primary figure that's above the ground level. Most people look at it as a god figure. Based on the wings, bird beak, and serpent god motif, some identify this figure as the first known depiction to reference the Mayan god Quetzalcoatl, meaning the feathered or raised up serpent. Clark and Moreno changed the features of this god depiction and drew an additional figure overlapping the tree that appears to be a woman with her arm reaching out. The texture mapping favors that it would actually be an extension of that deity, probably a bird mask or beak extending toward the tree. I believe this is one of those cases where potentially the methodology that Clark and Moreno used of zooming in, they zoomed in so far, they got to enough surface texture that you could almost connect the dots into a pattern that they wanted to be there. That maybe there were some sympathetic patterns, but it's not sustained as being true carving. Garth Norman's drawings were very accurate. With hardly any exceptions, every line that he has proposed on his line drawing remains. I've been down to see Izapa many times. I've seen it by day, I've seen it by rain, I've seen it by shine, I've seen it by night. I've been inside the enclosures, I've examined them up close, I've measured them myself. This is a place that I have a deep respect for and an incredible passion for trying to document in the most accurate way that we can. I have been to all of the significant stelae that have been relocated to other museums, the Tapachula Museum, the National Museum in Mexico City, and have been able to have the same intimacy that I've had in the field in terms of documenting with surface texture mapping and photogrammetry and physical measurements. I have since been to Society for American Archaeology, their annual meeting, multiple times, and presented to the best scholars, particularly of Mesoamerica in the world, and been received very well. There is additional documentation to do, and that will be forthcoming.
As we literally and figuratively shed more light onto the carvings of Izapa, this evidence provides an expanded foundation to re-examine the interpretation of the messages of Izapa with increased context. RTI, along with new breakthroughs in computer modeling technology, are now enabling the restoration of the Izapa temple complex in virtual reality. This will provide greater access to Izapa for everyone from researchers to Mayan school children who want to learn about the roots of their civilization and Izapa's rightful place in world history.